My great-great-aunt, Amalia Baracs, was named after her grandmother, Amalia Love, who was descended from a very distinguished Jewish family, which included the great rabbi, the Maharal of Prague. Budapest is divided into two parts, Buda and Pest. She was born in Pest, Hungary, in January 1897, into a middle-class Hungarian family. She was the eldest of four siblings, Eva, János, Sándor, and Sándor's identical twin Benj, who sadly died at the age of 3 from scarlet fever. Her father, Karl Baracs, was the second executive of the Hungarian railroads because a Jew was not allowed to be chief executive. Her father was also president of the Pest Jewish community and was a passionate book collector, him and the rest of the family being great admirers of the Goethe. Their whole family was very musical. They were highly cultured, for that was the way the Jews assimilated into the Hungarian way of things. The family were proud Hungarians and were secular, not Orthodox, and did not keep kosher. Her mother, Paula, was president of the Ladies' Guild. Amalia worshipped both her parents. She especially respected her father, who gave her her gift of love for literature and music. Later, though, her father sadly died in 1929 of a burst appendix. In a recording, Amalia talks about her family.
Well, I'm holding a picture in which I can see my mother and her 3 sisters. If my memory is correct, then the picture was taken in 1906 till 1913. Those 7 years belong to the happiest time of my life.
Before Hitler came to power, they lived quite comfortably. They all lived in a big grand house in Pest, which is now the Belgian embassy. They had 2 maids, Najmori and Kishmori, which means Big Mary and Little Mary. Also, the Baracs children traveled in their own train carriage and not a compartment, which is what most children did. All of her family and friends were living near her as she grew up, like János Starker and his family. János Starker would come over to play the cello to accompany her playing the piano. János later became one of the most famous cellists in the world. They lived in a close community and everyone knew everyone. The Fischers, the Krejcis, and the Baracs, who were all her cousins, also lived in Pest at the time. She was also very close to her sister, Eva, my great-grandmother, for they were the only girls out of all her cousins. When Amalia was 13 or 14 years old, she started keeping a daily diary, one that she continued writing until her death. It was very important for her to live life to the fullest, and by keeping a diary, it helped her. At the start of the First World War, she was just a teenager, 17 years old. Menfolk would be 14 years old and would have to go off to war, so many people they knew would die. It was a very difficult time for all of them. She lived next door to her cousins, the Krejcis, with whom she was very close. Together they would spend their summer holidays by the Austrian Millstatt. Towards the end of the First World War, during the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Krejcis were young idealists and followers of the Hungarian communist leader Bela Kun. After the failure of the short-lived Hungarian Communist Republic, the Krejcis were expelled from Hungary and escaped to Russia, which was a communist country. Stalin was the dictator who took over Russia, a ruthless and evil man. In the 1930s, the Krejcis were killed by him because he was paranoid and turned against the Jews. She and her grandmother became anti-communists. Amalia was always able to distinguish between the Russian culture, which she loved, and the Russian politics, which she hated. Amalia loved music, especially Mozart and Schubert, which she played on the piano. She was incredibly musical and learnt piano from Wojciech Margit. She would have liked to be a professional pianist, but this was not considered suitable. One of her pupils, with whom she kept in touch, became a famous opera teacher herself. She was also very talented at learning languages. She was a linguist, so it was no surprise that she became a language teacher. She taught in the Jewish gymnasium in Budapest in the 1920s, which was a Jewish girls' school. Since the Jewish academics lost their jobs because of all the anti-Semitic laws, they came to the school and the school got great teachers. At this time, she was fluent in Hungarian, German, and French. Later, after the war, she learned Russian as well as Dutch, Italian, and English. The system in the school that she taught was that the teacher taught the same class or grade for 7 years. In a painting of her that was later painted by Benedict Robert, a famous painter, she has a letter in her hand because she had a vast network of ex-pupils around the world with whom she kept up a correspondence. She had close bonds with her pupils. After the First World War, around 1924 or 1925, she got married. She was married for about 10 years to a man named George Fuchs. Her married name became Amalia Fuchs, but all her nieces and nephews called her Molly Nenny, which means Aunt Molly. Amalia loved George, but their relationship was very difficult. He got a disease called syphilis when he was young and would get very violent. He later died in 1936. This was one of the few times when she would stop writing in her diary, Times of Sorrow. She remained a widow the rest of her life and never had children, which was one of her biggest regrets. She always kept a photo of her husband by her bed. World War II started and Amalia was 42 years old. Despite all that was going on, some Jews stayed in Budapest. However, because Amalia was working in a Jewish school, she would be highly vulnerable. One of her ex-pupils, Rosa Vera, who later became a famous opera teacher, got Molly and her mother fake papers to go in hiding in the war. This allowed her to go with her mother during the war underground. Her sister had already left Hungary to live in Darmstadt, Germany. Then her sister and her husband escaped to London in 1936. She was able to communicate with them by writing letters and sending it through Portugal. Throughout the war, Amalia and her mother pretended to be peasant women from the countryside and lived with a Hungarian family. They never said who they really were, but the Hungarian family knew. Her mother later died in 1950. During the war, she saved the life of János Starker, her young friend. At that time, they were in an internment camp, and Amalia arranged for him to hide in Nagymori's village after he got the fake papers.
János Starker. Your mother and I went to a masterclass recital of János Starker, the cellist, at Yale University. At the end of the recital, we lined up to see him. In front of us, there were a number of other people, mainly people who were musicians at Yale. And when we got to the front of the line, I said, "You don't know me, but I am Eva Baracs' grandson." And he said to me, "Oh yes, I knew Eva Baracs, but the person that I know much, much better is a sister, Amalia Baracs, or Amalia Fuchs." And he said, "She was a very important person in my life." And at that moment, he turned away to face the wall. And when he turned back around again, there were tears coming out of his eyes. And he said, "She saved my life. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here today. That's how important she is to me." And all the other people around the room were just shocked. There was silence. And at that time, Molly, my aunt, great aunt, was still alive. And he said, "Somebody must write her biography, her story, because she has such an interesting life story." And every time that János Starker came to London, because he lived in Indiana, but every time he came to London to give a concert, he would always go to Marlene's house or Marlene's apartment and bring his cello, and then he'd play the cello while she accompanied him on the piano. That's the story of János Starker.
After the war, she continued being a teacher. In 1956, when she was 59, she was visiting her sister Eva, who lived in England. She traveled through Holland by boat. During her visit, there was an uprising in Hungary, so she stayed in London and didn't go back. She had brought nothing with her. She was a refugee from home. She had been in Hungary, someone who's independent and had a job, and suddenly she didn't have a professional life and was dependent on her sister and brother-in-law. Nevertheless, she built a wonderful life for herself and adapted. It was very hard for her, but softened by the fact that family is very important and she was close to all her nieces and nephews and great-nieces and great-nephews, since she didn't have any children or grandchildren. All of her nieces and nephews also felt very close to her, and didn't distinguish between their grandma and great-aunt. They were both very important to them. When she was visiting her brother in Holland, she wanted to go back to Budapest to get her stuff, but her sister didn't want her to, since it was very dangerous. When she was much older and her brother-in-law had died, Malineni moved into a single room in the house. She had a small bed, a little nook, and a tiny kitchen. She wasn't complaining. She was very comfortable. She didn't have an income of her own, so she was slightly squeezed after not having a job. Her greatest pleasure was a weekly lunch with her brother, who had also moved to England, in a restaurant. The Jewish Bazaar happened once a year. It was a fundraiser to help support Hungarian Jews in London. They'd always serve traditional Hungarian desserts. Malineni became involved in it. Also, in her 80s, Malineni became the commissioning editor for the newsletter of the Hungarian Jewish community in London. She had the most incredible memory. Her niece's husband, my grandpa, would come on Thursdays and read an article for the newspaper that he had written for her, and she would memorize it and tell her secretary the next day. Malineni's sister Eva had 3 children, Charlotte, John, and Agatha. Agatha, my grandmother, had 3 children, my dad Jonathan, his older sister Deborah, and his younger sister Sharon. Sharon has 4 children and lives in London. My other aunt Deborah has 3 children and lives in Oxford. My dad married my mom Abby and had 4 children, my brother Amos, my sister Maytal, my sister Mimi, and me. Malineni later sadly passed away in 1992. She is buried in Golders Green Jewish Cemetery next to my great-grandparents. Musical notes from Mozart adorn her gravestone. Malineni may not have any children, but her memory and love of music, life, and literature lives on through her ex-pupils, her nieces and nephews, her great-nieces and great-nephews, and remains in all of the hearts of anyone that knew her. Even though I didn't get to meet her, I feel very lucky to have learned so much about my great-great-aunt Malineni.